called patio furniture. So it'll be in the sanctuary, so it's next week. So it's a free concert, so we're not going to try to compete with patio furniture. Temple, I just know when I'm eating it, so just lay down and die. You know what I mean? So see the field. So that's next Tuesday, and then we'll come back the first two Tuesday nights in March. So March 4th and 11th. That's what happens. The last two sessions. And then we'll kind of see where you want to go from here. I'll have a card where you can suggest topics, and we'll figure out who's going to be around and when you want to do the next one. But I work here now, so I can. All right. Well, I don't want to take any more time from the content piece. We are working through this subject of a house for my name, and we're going to look at week 2. And in this week, there's really two movements. There's the falling of a temple, but in the kind of as the temple's falling, there's a new vision of a temple that arrives. So it's quite an interesting parallel that happens. So let's have a brief word of prayer. Father God, we are going into some deep areas of mystery here, where words just can't really be explained. You've put together thousands of years of visual images to impact us over time. So we just ask for your Spirit's guidance as we talk about and listen, and we just ask through the sovereignty of your Spirit to speak through what is spoken, to apply your word in our hearts and minds so that what we hear is what you would have us hear and grow us as your disciples. We ask this in Christ's name. So again, to kind of put this in context, we are in week 2, and what that means is that last week we went through the first temple period, that's Solomon's temple. So that was last week, and now we pick up this period from when the temple was built until when it is destroyed. So, and the vision that's going to happen there. Now next week, so the story ends with kind of this Babylonian destruction of the temple, and then next week we'll talk about what happened after that, the effort to restore it and so forth, all the way through the beginning of what we call the second temple period. So this is where we are. It's a very short period of time, a 70-year just, and you'll see why in a moment. But that's the period we're going to work on. But it's a very significant portion in the history of God's people. Key to understanding this whole section of God's history is this division of the children of Israel. After Solomon dies, there's a revolt. And if you know how that kingdom emerged, David was always challenged. He was king of Judah long before he was king of Israel, the whole of Israel. Judah was the southern tribe, with a small tribe of Benjamin that was usually allies with it. The whole other 10 tribes were part of the northern kingdom. And David always struggled to keep that northern kingdom unified, and Solomon was the one that cemented it. But as so often happens when the strong leader passes away, that northern group of 10 tribes broke away and formed their own country of Israel. And you kind of see the two colors here. This is the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And one of the early kings in the northern part was a man by the name of Jeroboam. And he saw that there was a problem in that because of God's mandate, everybody had to go to the same temple in Jerusalem. There was one temple. And he did not want all his people going south into another kingdom to do their worship. And so he created these 2 additional sanctuaries, one in the northern tip in Dan, one in the southern tip in Bethel. And what we read in the scriptures is that he put in these golden calves. If you remember, the golden calves were actually used in the wilderness wandering. It was a very popular image in the worship of Baal and some of the other Canaanite gods. So there was some, what we call syncretism. There was a worship of Yahweh, but there was also a worship of the other local gods in this area. And he put them right in these 2 sanctuaries. And that became known over the next period of time. There's a constant reference in the scripture to the sin of Jeroboam. This idea that he just removed the worship out of the one temple, and the people in the north now began to have this division apart about the gods that they were worshiping. And so these kings in the north were often compared to their sins were even worse than the sin of Jeroboam. So they just kind of went downhill from there. So it really is the beginning of the end. It's one generation after Solomon, the kingdom starts to fall apart. So it's really in that context that we need to see this next section of the history. Interestingly enough, as always, there's these debates about whether these things existed, and there's an archaeologist by the name of Abraham Biran who's been working in this section of Dan for 20 years, more than that, since 1966. So the article I read was from 20 years. And he's been in this area just uncovering layers of civilization there. And I won't bore you with all the history there, but there's ongoing archaeological discussions about how many cities were there and not there at the time when supposedly Joshua came in. But in his digs, he found this amazing kind of altar space that was, he believes, used as an altar. There were signs that it was actually used as a sacrificial altar. And they can date it through the other items that are in that strata of pretty much being around this time. So we think this might have been the altar area used for one of those two sanctuaries in Dan. So it's just another case of the archaeology kind of helping us to see that this is history, not just fiction. But you can go look that up on the internet, and there's all kinds of documentation on that. The disintegration of the temple begins then when the northern tribes separate and no longer worship in Jerusalem. But then the kings in the south began to also dismantle the temple in various ways. Various kings are better than others as far as keeping faithful to the covenant. Many of them began to introduce foreign gods. We just did a series on King Ahab and all the foreign gods he brought in there. So it's a mixture. But with particular attention to the temple itself, a number of things began to happen. And you remember all the gold we mentioned last week, Matt brought it up. It's like everything's covered in gold, 3,000 tons of gold, plus all the silver, well, that's a huge bank for everybody to just ignore, right? And so what began to happen as the northern kingdom left and they were more exposed is a lot of times that temple wealth was raided. Shortly after, Rehoboam was the first king under which the kingdom divided. Shishak, the king of Egypt, comes in on a series of north raids. There's this ongoing battle between Syria in the north and Egypt in the south to own this land. And in one of those raids it came through, and he just loots out the temple. So you can see the scripture here that refers to those. Later in the story, there are a couple good kings in there. Two of them with Asa and Joash. They go through a period of trying to reform the temple and the worship after some kind of bad predecessors. But then they get themselves into financial problems. And as I said, there's always this pincer movement between the kingdom of Aram in the north, which we would know as Syria, and the kingdom of Egypt in the south. And they're always trying to play against one another because somebody's trying to invade from the north and other people from the south. That sounds familiar, right? But that went on. And so what ended up happening, both of these kings, even though they tried to restore the temple, never back to Solomon's standards, they actually raided the temple and took gold and treasures and gifts and so forth, intended for the temple to pay off the north, the king of Aram. In one case, Asa uses it to convince the kings of Aram to go attack Israel, their northern neighbors, because it's like a mercenary payment. And in the other case, be careful of paying mercenaries, because the next time they turn around, Aram's actually ready to invade Judah, and they have to pay a ransom to the king to keep them from coming in and raiding the temple. So the temple gets gutted. It's kind of like it gets gutted, they give back, restore it, something else happens, they gut it again. So this constant depletion of the temple. Then you have King Joash, and it's kind of confusing when you read the story, because sometimes the king in the north, the king in the south have the exact same Hebrew name at the exact same time. So that's fun to read. So the English versions kind of give them different spellings. But while Joash was there, the king of the north was Jehoash, is the way the NIV translates it. But he comes down and actually just loots the temple. Like after they put all that money into it, restoring it, he just comes down and invades Judah and takes the money. So now you can see the extent to which this temple is nowhere near the glory that it once had. I mean, it's being repeatedly pillaged. Until finally we get to Ahaz and Hezekiah. And it was during that period that the Assyrian becomes a new threat. So first it's Syria and Egypt. Now we have the Assyrians from clear on the other side. They start invading. And on separate occasions, these two kings, again, wants to convince the Assyrians to go attack the people to the north, then the next time so they wouldn't invade Jerusalem. So again, so that even Hezekiah, who's kind of like the high point of good kings, and even he has to raise the temple for money to keep the enemies away. So you have this repeated kind of bang, bang, bang of the disintegration of this temple that was built by Solomon. So it barely lasted in his generation. That's the story. The spiritual deterioration, material deterioration, the country is divided, so we're clearly on some sort of downward trend. All right? Again, if you weren't here last week, I'll go on forever. If you want to stop me, stop, ask me questions, and I'll fill in as I can. I'll try to remember to pause from time to time. So, we do then get to this period of Babylonian captivity. Now, what eventually happens, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, it's part of another story, but if we go back here, what ends up happening is that kingdom that broke away in the north, Israel, when Assyria comes in to invade, they actually conquer all of the northern kingdom of Israel. 722 is usually given, BC is given the date, when they come in and they just take over the whole kingdom. So like basically 10 tribes are just wiped out. There is no more kingdom of Israel. The shrines in Bethel and Dan are leveled. And Assyria had this policy, as many ancient conquerors did, is taking the local people and exiling them, taking them to another land and bringing foreigners to occupy the land. And when Assyria comes in and wipes out the northern kingdom of Israel, 10 of the tribes just disappear. I mean, you've heard the lost tribes of Israel. These are the lost tribes of Israel. 10 tribes of Israel just disappeared. They were shipped wherever. And different theories about where they ended up. You take the 23andMe to see where the chromosomes was. But where those tribes ended up and how they intermarried with the local folks and where did they just disappear. There is no more 10 tribes. By 722, we're down to 2 tribes left of the original 12. 2.5, right? I mean, you have Judea, the Judeans, or the tribe of Judah, and you have the tribe of Benjamin that still exists, and then there are some Levites. Their job was to wait on the temple. So that's all you've got left. Like, so the temple's depleted, the kingdom is depleted, spiritual life is depleted. So really by 722, you've got this little kingdom of Judah trying to fight back against this mighty army of Assyria. And God, through Hezekiah, does this incredible miracle to keep the king of Assyria out. In addition to the money paid, God God takes control of the situation, defeats the enemy, and forces Assyria to retreat. So at the end of the day, Jerusalem still exists, Judah still exists, and there is rejoicing. Now, that goes on from 722 for another couple hundred years, but then something starts to happen. We have a new enemy in town, and the new enemy in town is Babylon. So you can see previously, the previous enemy was Syria. They came down and took over all this. Now there's just Judah down here. And we have a new enemy in town, and it's Babylon. And so Babylon starts invading, and there are debates about this. The biblical record tells us that these invasions probably began around 605 BC. Again, there's some debate about that, but that's kind of where I think it began. But there's a series of invasions, and each time Babylon breaks into Judea, they take captives back with them. So slowly there is that transportation of people back from Judah, and now they are brought back to Babylon, and Babylon becomes the center of Jewish history now, really through most of the ancient and even into the modern world. I mean, that's why, for example, those of you from the Jewish tradition, you know the Babylonian Talmud and all those things. I mean, Babylon becomes the center of Judaism here. The biblical stories of Daniel and Ezekiel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, remember the fire, all this stuff, those stories of Babylon, of these people that were taken away. So, at the end of that invasion and captivity, they invade and just wipe out Jerusalem, just raze Jerusalem to the ground. So just as the northern kingdom was defeated by the Assyrians in 722, you have the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin wiped out 587, 586, somewhere in there. Usually 586 is the date. So no more southern kingdom, like gone, gone, gone. Like they took the king, put in a puppet king, and he reigned on behalf of the king of Babylon. And we're at the end. There are no more kings now in Judea. It's the end of the line. There's nothing, right? And as part of that, the temple is razed to the ground. And you have this prediction, if you will, or this statement of damage in Kings, that the Lord has declared Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had and made for the temple of the Lord. And they just cut up the gold and took it back. I think I mentioned last week, those huge pillars that were there still standing, they actually had to cut them into sections, we know from other records, to get them and take them to Babylon. And archaeologists have been able to go into this area of Jerusalem and find ash heaps where things were burned and layers of their culture that was just destroyed and intermixed with tokens of war to show that this really happened. So the whole country is defeated, and in the process, the temple is now gone, and it's just vestiges of broken down stones on itself. And in the midst of all of that, we have this prophet. One of the prophets, Isaiah foresaw it a couple hundred years before this, but Jeremiah is there during the events, both before, during, and after. Jeremiah is kind of as a witness to all this. And there's this prophetic message that he preaches, and he tells them up front, look, this is going to happen. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do. He's like, go to Babylon, get used to it, you're going to be there for a while. And part of that message has a number in it. It says, this whole community will become a desolate wasteland. And these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. We're given a number. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord, and I will make it this. So there's this judgment on Judah for 70 years. Remember that Hebrew number of 70, it's kind of this idea of a complete, powerful cleansing, judgment. 70 years of judgment, right? The destruction of Babylon, or destruction of Judah, and then the Babylonians themselves will be destroyed, and we know that occurred when Cyrus the Great from Persia comes in and wipes out the Babylonian Empire. And so then we have another era. And it's right at that point, which we'll pick up next week, that's when the children of Israel are allowed to return to Judah and start building the next temple. But at this stage, it's gone. And if you look at the time map, and I put this, I won't go through the detail, but you can see I gave you kind of the breakout of those three sieges and that group coming over, starting in 605 until, if you go from 605 to the building of the temple, which we will see next week, that there is a exact period, really, the captivity period before the release to go back, it really is about 70 years. I mean, mathematically, it works out to that. When Cyrus the Great gives that decree that the children of Israel can now return, and they start to return back and start the rebuilding process. So Jeremiah foresees that before the event, and the course of history actually kind of spells that out through those sieges. So by the time, though, we get to 586 BC, the children of Israel are, 10 tribes are gone. We don't even know where they are. They're just like lost in the wind. All the wealthy and influential people of Judah are now in Babylon and are being enculturated into Babylon. That's the whole story of Daniel and his friends, is to enculturate the Judeans as Babylonians. So that even their tradition, their religion is wiped out. That was the plan. It didn't work because the Jewish tradition was so strong. They gathered and it actually becomes a center for Judaism as we know it today. They are the ones who began to pull together the biblical records and turn it into the scriptures as we know them. I mean, they did a lot of work when they were captive in Babylon. But it is that 70-year period. So, that all begs a question which we need to ask. Why did God let that happen? I mean, didn't he just say to Solomon, I'll be here forever? Didn't he say, this is my house, the house of my name? Didn't he promise David that there will always be someone from his throne, someone from his line on the throne? And here we are, 586. There's no more temple, no more king, no more Israel, and for all intents and purposes, no more Judea. It's all gone. There's, whoa, you know? Whoa. I mean, let alone all these centuries later, this millennia later, we're like, whoa, but imagine you lived there. Some of you are living many versions of that, right? I mean, there used to be an island here with houses, and you're like, now there's an island with records, and we're living somewhere else. We got exiled. But at a much greater and much more excruciating level, that religious exile movement. So it really is a sad time in Israel's history, of course, and it becomes this major theme that's revisited over and over again. Now, what's interesting is one of those exiles was a man by the name of Ezekiel. He came over in one of those early transpositions, or those early kind of forced marches from Judea to Babylon. And we have his wonderful story. It's just, did I teach a class here on that? I know I did a sermon series, but I taught classes. It's a whole separate, amazing story in itself. But he has this vision, Ezekiel 1:1, in that period, and he has it from Babylon. And it's kind of, you can see the city of Babylon and some of the other cities that he mentions there. So he's there in captivity, and he has these visions. And it'd be interesting for you to go back and read that vision, but he sees people going back to the temple. Now, at this point, the temple is still there. Later in Ezekiel's life, it's gone. Like he lives before the fall of the temple. He lives in one of those early exiles, but later on that temple will fall. But still while it's alive, he has a vision, a heavenly vision of this angel transporting him back to Jerusalem. And he goes through and he says, I want you to see what's going on in this temple that's supposed to be God's place. And you go into the temple and they're worshiping foreign gods there. The priests are doing all kinds of crazy stuff in there. And he's like, you see what's going on there? This is supposed to be a house of my name, but I've left it go. If you see what's happening there? And the message is, I got to do something. I mean, this is not okay. And the prediction is made that this temple is going to go. I mean, you can't just call this a house of God and then let it stand there doing what it's doing. It's going away. And he's telling this. He's saying it ahead of time, so when it happens, everybody say, well, I caught God off guard. No, he's the one that made it happen. And here's why, because of this just massive, just brokenness of this church. It's interesting, in the Reformation, I'm not saying it was correct, but it was a model that was used. Martin Luther wrote this book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, and his argument was the Catholic Church has become the new Babylon. And it's such a mess that God has to destroy it. That was his theme. Not politically correct, but that was his theme back in the day that he wrote the book, Babylonian Captivity. This model of what happens to a church that gets so corrupted now needs to be done away with. So he sees these visions, and it's the vision of these chariots and the throne of God coming to earth, the same kind of vision that Solomon sees, that God is like sending his holy throne room down here saying, yeah, this is not it. That's what he sees. All right, so in the context of that, if we skip to the end of the book, which I have to do in a half-hour talk on the history of the world, the final chapters, if you start in verse 40, or chapter 40 to the end of the book, there is this different vision. And it's unlike the initial vision where there's all this corruption in the temple as it exists. This new vision has this perfect temple. And you get a person there who has a reed, and they walk around and it makes for very boring reading. This is the part you fall asleep on. But it's like there's so many reeds or cubits or whatever the word is of your translation, from here to here, and from this to this, and from this alcove to that alcove, and you're like, oh my gosh, I should have missed this meeting. It's not for me. But if you walk through it, what he's really doing there is showing you how perfectly symmetrical and perfectly square this is. It's perfect. Perfect in its form. And scholars debate about how big it is and how wide it is. What is its size with regard to the Temple of Solomon? The problem is how to translate things, but the numbers that are used really suggest that this box, if you will, this 500 cubit box that they have, it's not really right in the center of the city of Jerusalem. It's outside in a holy place. It's overlooking this holy space. And it's a perfect place with the new altar. Now, the size of the temple, the size of the altar, depending on how you interpret it, was either much bigger or about the same size. But it's not even the size so much as the perfection of all the gates. And there is, of course, a debate about what it is that Ezekiel really saw. I mean, what is this temple? I mean, is this a temple that's going to be built someday? I mean, we're not given exact specifications. It's not as if this is an engineering drawing. We're not given all the details of all the specs. But we're given a pretty, enough measurements to see this was a perfectly square situation. In fact, at the time, it's unclear whether it would even fit on Mount Moriah. Because for both Solomon's temple, we're not sure how big Solomon's courtyard was, but to even have a courtyard, you have to kind of build retaining walls around the mountain and start to fill it in with stuff. And by the time we get to the first temple, and Herod's temple, he built walls all around it. And what you see today, where the Dome of the Rock is, that's not just the mountain, that's retaining walls that have been built over centuries and just stuff thrown in there. And there's this big, huge square place that now this would fit. But in that day, there's a question whether it would even fit on that mountain. Because Solomon maybe had one wall, but it's pretty clear he probably didn't have all four. That was Herod's doing. Anyway, so what is he building here? Is this a temple that's going to be built? Some people suggest this was giving ahead of time what the second temple, when Zerubbabel comes back, what we're going to talk about next week, this is what he was supposed to build. Turns out he didn't build that. What they built there was much smaller. Or is this, as some people claim, a temple to be built there in the future? Like at some point, when Christ returns, they're going to build this temple in the future this way. Some people believe that. There's another possibility that I'll suggest kind of later. And again, do we know? Sometimes prophecy, it's the future, right? So we don't know until the future happens. Yeah. My dad and I have these conversations often, and he disagreed with me on a lot of this stuff. But I said, well, when you get to heaven, they'll tell you you should have listened to me. Because you don't know. The future is you don't know. You know, I mean, it's about the future. Who knows? You don't know until the future happens, right? So anyway, you can see this. It's like a vision, not just of the temple and the altar in the center, but it's all the kind of the gates around the side. And in many ways, it looks like the old temple, but there's significant differences in terms of the sacrifices that are there, the numbers that are given. It's not. You can tell this is not the same. It's similar. You can tell it was cast in a similar mode, but it is much different. And keep an eye on this river right here. That's going to come back. That was never in the original drawings. That was never in Solomon's. Like there's this river that flows out of the middle of this and kind of drifts off the map. What's that? And it's pretty clear. The other interesting part of this story, if you continue to read through Ezekiel 45, there's a section there where the land, the promised land, is given, and it's pretty specific, and this is an artist's rendition of what's said there. But the idea is, look who we have back. All of these tribes that disappeared are now there again. And they're in perfectly symmetrical quadrants. It's been perfectly arranged, like the blocks in New York City, Manhattan. You know what I mean? It's like, but they're all arranged perfectly. And in the center is this place where the priests and Levites, if you remember how the tabernacle was originally arranged, they had their space right near. Now again, the temple, in all likelihood, was outside the city, not in the city, but possibly to the north. Some said even in the city of Bethel. It's hard to tell where the temple is in relationship to this, but not necessarily in here, and probably not in Jerusalem, at least the way the text of Ezekiel reads, which is one of the challenges if you believe that temple is supposed to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. That's not really what the text says. But in any case, and you do have this river Jordan here, but in the picture of that Ezekiel sees, the river starts in the temple and flows out of it. What's that about? But just notice here, the significant part of this is, wait a minute, I thought the 10 tribes were gone. Like they're gone. Nobody even knows where they are. And the promise Ezekiel says, you remember the good old days of Solomon where, and under Joshua and Moses, and every tribe got their land? We're going back to that. We're going back to that. Again, the question comes up, is this literal? Like, is this going to happen one day? Like, we're going to have this land and it's all going to be divided in these nice even quadrants, and we're going to find out where all the leftovers from Dan are. God has them in some secret archive somewhere. And somehow he traces the bloodlines to, I don't know how you do that all these centuries later. In the Jewish tradition it goes to the mother, and after everybody's married to everybody, and I don't know if there's enough room for all the Jewish people in Brooklyn. I don't know where they live. But, there is that kind of idea that at some point, God restores these lost tribes. Like, we will find them. His children will be found. There is that vision. And the question is, how literal is this? What does this represent? Is this a physical restoration of physical Israelites to this land? Is that what Ezekiel is seeing? Possible. One other interesting part of this, though, is there's a stress on all this, that when all this happens, and this was in the original law, you'd see this from time to time throughout Leviticus and Numbers, this command to Moses, that you have to be kind to strangers. Like, strangers have to be given some rights there in that group. But then we have this very bold proclamation. You are to consider them, that is, the foreigners residing among you. Right? It's talking about foreigners that reside among you. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites. Whoa. Whoa. You go through the Old Testament and there's all these signs to separate themselves from the local, how they were circumcised and what they ate and what they wore. All this was to distinguish them from the local population. But now what Ezekiel sees is this new Israel, if you will, where you are considered foreigners as native-born citizens. There's not supposed to be this distinction, which is quite a dramatic statement, to make in this Jewish context. I mean, and he's making it in this area of Babylon. These Jewish people are now, put away to this section, confines, compounds, later known as ghettos. I mean, they had to go there. He's saying, look, there will be foreigners living among you when that happens. Treat them as your native-born residents. Along with you, they will be allotted inheritance among the tribes of Israel. Wait a minute. They allotted it all out. They allotted all the land, and there's lines, but he's saying, I just want you to know that these foreigners, they're going to get land too. It's going to be allotted to them. A very, very powerful statement. And then one other interesting picture there, if you continue to read this story of Ezekiel 47, then when the temple, when he does the tour of all this land and everything, he brings him back to the temple, and then he sees this. The man brought me back to this entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple, towards the east, for the temple faced the east. So it's facing east, kind of Jerusalem, the main entrance facing toward Babylon, almost. It's that way, towards the rising of the sun. It's facing that way. And there's this, which is interesting too, because the Jordan River goes south, not east. But this river goes east. It comes out of the middle of this temple towards the east. And the water coming from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. So there's this, then it does come out of the south, like the Jordan River itself. And the idea is this water comes out. And if you follow the story, it starts out with this trickle in the land of the temple, but then it goes, the further you go south, the wider and deeper and wider and deeper, until like there are fish jumping out everywhere, the fisherman's dream, Anne Maria, just fish jumping everywhere. It's like, what is that? I mean, is that literal too? Like there's going to be a huge, like the Jordan River. Now it empties out into the Dead Sea. Nothing goes there. But what this is a picture of this pond that's filled with life and trees just sprouting up all around it. Wait a minute, it starts to look like the Garden of Eden. And the two rivers are there. So that's the vision. I challenge you to go back. It's just exciting. When you put whatever trash novel you're working on in your book club and read this. Okay, it's much better. So here's the big picture. I got 5 minutes before the children in bed. Speaking of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they will level us to the ground until only minor things are left. The obvious question: why would God let all this happen? Like this is crazy. Like, what's going on? Like, why does He let these armies come in and just wipe out His own people, send them into exile, wipe out the temple? What's His point? Like, okay, He's making a point. Clearly, there's a point. What's the point? And to answer that, I want us to kind of see the cycle that you see repeated in Scripture over and over again. And this is one of those cycles. The cycle usually, if it starts in Genesis, it starts with creation, right? You have this creation of this beautiful garden. Then humanity messes up, they do something, and like now God creates them to live in paradise, but they don't want to live in paradise. They want to chase their own dreams. God says, well, then you can't live here because it doesn't work. The way paradise works is you got to listen. It doesn't work if you don't listen. So there's this human rebellion, and then God has to be true to His word and prove to them, look, I'm telling you, you have to listen to it. So in the case of Adam and Eve, they're kicked out of the garden, and there's this warrior that stands there, this angelic warrior says, you can't get back in. You can't get in. Right? So then you see that story repeated with the flood of Noah, right? I mean, again, blessing pours out. God says, your rebellion, there's going to be judgment. And there is. The world is wiped out. You see it again in the children of Israel. They're in the promised land. Give to Abraham. There's rebellion. They're in Egypt. They're trapped there. God has to judge. They get delivered they get out of slavery. God gives them again to the promised land. They go through a period of time. Now here we are again. The whole thing messed up. And all those centuries later, now they don't have a country. They don't have a temple. They don't have a land. Kicked out of the garden again. So that cycle of human rebellion is followed by divine judgment. And then That's never the last word for God. It's never like, okay, story over, I'm out of here. Wish you would have listened to me. No, then there's the next step where he just keeps trying. Like even after Adam and Eve get kicked out, he sends the story of Seth, and you see him reaching out through the prophets. There's judgment. He gives Noah, who continues to carry his stuff forward. The whole world goes to hell in a handbasket. He picks Abraham and says, I'll talk to him. Abraham's family starts to fall apart. He says, I'll talk to Moses. I'll talk to him. You know, and you just go through that story over and over again. God never gives up. He's always in this world. I know you messed up, and I know I judged, and I did everything, but I'm not done. Like, there's another step here. It's called restoration, right? Then, with the New Testament, you have this other dimension that Jesus has been in the center of this since the whole time. That's really, we're just in another cycle. This has all been leading us to show us that Jesus is that last act. There is sin, there is rebellion, there is judgment. It's why the world is so messed up, that's still happening. But Jesus is this eternal witness to say, I'm not done until I'm done. And that's really the story of the New Testament and the story of the time we're in and the story of Revelation, which we'll do another day, about how God is saying, look, I'm going to get back to the garden. When we're done, this vision of Ezekiel, of this perfect place of worship, the way I always intended it, which, by the way, has all those sides of the garden, all those carvings, all those vines. It's all interwoven into Ezekiel's story. This beautiful river of life that used to flow through the middle of the garden is now there. It's a restoration. What I think that vision of Ezekiel is he's saying in very terms that would make sense to that culture, I'm going to build that all over again. I'm not done. And all the people in the world, remember, Eden itself was meant to be a microcosm of the whole earth, which was good. And when he's done, the whole earth will be his garden, and the whole earth will be given to his children. They will all be the same, treated, their inheritance. I think that's the story of Ezekiel. And that's really the message of Jesus. And in the New Testament, we're actually dealing that in the book of Acts, where God says we're in that transition now, where, remember, God said this is for everybody? We're in that part of the story now. That this is for everybody, for the whole world, and the whole world eventually will be his inheritance. So that really is the story. So what does that mean as we exactly hit 7:30? What does that mean? What's the point? Well, summarizing 70 years of brutal history, which is itself a microcosm of centuries of history, I think tonight, if you ask me, this is to me the twofold message of this story of the destruction of the temple, but then this vision to Ezekiel. The destruction teaches us that where we will end up without God's engagement in our lives. Like God created us to be engaged in our lives. We are meant to be engaged with God. We're meant to be talking to Him, listening to Him, following Him, fellowshipping with Him, loving Him. That's the garden. And we were meant to live that life in fellowship with Him. But if we don't, and if we choose we don't need Him, and if we choose to pursue our own stuff, watch how many times the story has to teach you. You see where this ends up? It ends in a ditch with other people devouring your souls. Like, I'm just telling you, that's where it will end. I don't know how many more times I have to show you that that's what's going to happen, but that's what's going to happen. That really is the message of the Babylonian destruction of the temple for his people. He's saying, look, you think you're my people, but you understand that there's that other side that requires your continued engagement with me, and if you don't do that, it's of no good to you. God is still God. He doesn't change. His love doesn't change. His desire for people doesn't change. But we don't realize the blessings. It's not like He's just, sometimes He does. He's just like, well, I know you don't deserve it, but here's a gift. You know, I mean, that's every day. But at some point, our decisions not to engage with Him will end up where Babylon ended up. And that's the message on that side. But at the same time, it's so interesting to me that in the middle of this destruction, you get this vision from Ezekiel where God's saying, you see how everything's destroying, but let me show you this other theme that I'm going to wave in. Ezekiel's vision teaches us that God has not given up on His dream. God has not given up on His desire to engage with us. We've decided we don't want to engage with Him. We'd rather engage with other gods and do other things and chase our own stuff. But God said, just so you know, I haven't given up on you. I still want to engage with you. And that's the message of Ezekiel, like, remember what I did in the garden? Remember what I did with Abraham? Remember what I did after Noah? Like, I'm not done. Just so you know, from my side, I'm not done. And I will do it. And it will be restored. And you will see everything the glory that you had, you're going to get it back and more. And it's worth the whole world. I think that's really the point. So that's part 2 of the story of the temple in half an hour or less. Any questions? Yes?
What is the time frame of Jeremiah's warning?
He is around probably in the early part of the Babylonian Empire, so it's probably 40, 50 years before the event, something to that effect. Yes.
When they took off out of Judea and all the way over around to Babylon, I saw the route that they had to take in the desert.
Yeah, there's reasons.
They didn't go through, obviously,
No, not the most direct route.
they just went up to the...
Yeah, and I wish, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember the distance, but we're talking months. And it wasn't like, everybody get on the bullet train. This was like, pack up whatever stuff you can and you keep walking. So it's like forced march, hundreds of miles. And many of them died along the way, according to the records we have. I mean, not everybody made it, especially the elderly and infirm. They didn't get... Yeah, it's forced. I mean, we see it now, those forced marches, and it's just a horrible scene. It's a horrible scene. It is definitely seared in the conscience of this people to this day. I've been analogous to some of you folks, World War II is seared in your conscience, or, Vietnam War seared in your conscience. This is on a different, and the whole people have been seared to this day. Other questions? I know it's a little warm in here, and I appreciate it. Most of you stayed awake anyway, and nobody broke their neck on the way down, so I appreciate that. All right, remember, next week you get a break. You get to listen to Irish music. And then in 2 weeks, we'll come back and we're going to see how God makes true on his promise. At the end of 70 years, Cyrus becomes the king of Persia and says, okay, now children of Israel, you can go back and you can rebuild. And we're going to see how that story of rebuilding kind of unfolds through the centuries. Okay? Thank you all. Grab a sandwich as you go. Have a sandwich or a salad and a cup of tea and a cookie, and be on your way. Thank you.